Putin and his officials have repeatedly threatened to use Russia's nuclear arsenal in an effort to deter the US and its allies from supporting Ukraine and helping it resist the all-out Russian invasion launched in February. One fear is that he could use a short-range tactical nuclear weapon to try to stop Ukraine's counter-offensive in its track and force Kyiv to negotiate and cede territory. If Russia did use a nuclear weapon, it will leave the US and its allies with the dilemma of how to respond, with most experts and former officials predicting that if Washington struck back militarily, it would most likely be with conventional weapons to try to avert rapid escalation to an all-out nuclear war. But Biden said he doesn't think there is any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. Joe Biden has warned the world could face Armageddon if Vladimir Putin used a tactical nuclear weapon to try to win the war in Ukraine. The US president made his most outspoken remarks to date about the threat of nuclear war at a Democratic fundraiser in New York, saying it was the closest the world has come to nuclear catastrophe for 60 years. US intelligence agencies believe that Putin has come to see defeat in Ukraine as an existential threat to his regime, which he associates with the existential threat to Russia, potentially justifying, according to his worldview, the use of nuclear weapons. The European Union must take Vladimir Putin's threat he could use nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine seriously. His remarks come as Russia begins a partial mobilization and move to annex 4 regions in Ukraine. Mr. Putin has faced setback on the battlefield, with his forces pushed back by Ukrainian counter-offensive. Certainly, it's a dangerous moment because the Russian army has been pushed into a corner, and Putin's reaction, threatening using nuclear arms, it's very bad. 7 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, analysts agree that President Putin's forces are on a back foot, but he said a diplomatic solution must be reached, one that preserves the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In the same speech, President Putin announced the call-up of 300,000 Russians who have done compulsory military service, sparking protests and reports of people fleeing the country to avoid being sent to the front line. It comes after a rapid counter-offensive in which Ukraine says it took more than 8,000 square kilometers back from Russian forces. Now, self-styled referendum on joining Russia are being held in 4 occupied regions. Ukraine has denounced these as annexation attempts and reported that armed Russian soldiers are going door to door collecting votes. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian officials have begun to prepare their society for the possible use of nuclear weapons, but added that he does not believe Russia is ready to use them. President Zelensky denied having urged strikes on Russia, claiming that an earlier remark had been mistranslated. In recent weeks, the Ukrainian army has recaptured large swaths of territory in a successful counter-offensive that has forced Russian troops to abandon long-held positions. In what Kyiv describes as Moscow's response to its defeat, President Vladimir Putin has incorporated 4 partially occupied regions of Ukraine. The annexations, widely dismissed as illegal, have raised fears of a possible escalation in the 7-month war. President Putin and other senior Russian officials have suggested that nuclear weapons, possibly smaller tactical weapons, could be used to defend those areas, although Western officials say there has been no evidence that Moscow is preparing to do so. However, he denied having called for strikes on Russia during an online event, saying that the Ukrainian word he had used has been misunderstood. The initial comment was denounced by Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov as an appeal to start yet another world war, while Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said it demonstrated why Russia was right to launch its operation in Ukraine. The interview happened hours after US President Joe Biden said that the Russian threats to use nuclear weapons had brought the war closer to Armageddon than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War. President Zelensky said actions were needed now as Russia's threats were at risk of the whole planet. Moscow, he claimed, had made a step already by occupying the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear station, which President Putin is trying to turn into Russian property. And around 500 Russian troops were at the plant, he said, although the Ukrainian staff still operated. Empowered by sophisticated Western supply weapons, the Ukrainian army had made significant advances in the east and the south, reclaiming towns and villages, even in areas the Kremlin claims are not part of Russia. President Zelensky said Russian forces were putting up on a good enough fight, but that Ukraine had received weapons. The Russian military setback, a major embarrassment for President Putin, have sparked unusual criticism on the country's military. Amid the losses, President Putin announced the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of reservists, which led to rare anti-war protests in Russia and to a huge exodus of military-aged men.